Hey everyone, thanks for checking in. Chase here from Rocky Mountain ATV, and as you can see, I have my new 2021 CRF450R from Honda. Honda revamped this bike for 2021. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that already. There was a lot of anticipation with this, and we are a little bit late to the party as far as the first impressions. Honda was a little bit behind getting these to their dealerships, but the second it showed up, we got it. I've had 2 days of riding on this so far. I rode one track that's pretty smooth and hard packed with a lot of jumps, beautiful track, it's on a golf course. And then the next day I went up to another track that gets a lot of deep ruts, square edgy, a lot of braking bumps, really more of just outdoor national track. Now as far as the big updates with the new Honda, I'm not gonna sit here and ramble off every little thing that they have done because that would take forever. You can read all about that if you click on the link in this video. But the big updates that you've now seen is all new bodywork. You have a new frame. They've narrowed it up a little bit. In fact, they shaved off about 1.5 pounds of weight off the frame. So it's a narrower frame. They've got new engine mapping as well, which made the characteristic of the bike a lot different. They now have a hydraulic clutch up in the front, and they also did reduce the lateral rigidity of the frame by about 20% just to make this bike a little bit more compliant, which is really going to help this bike settle in the corners and just make it an easier, overall more fun bike, in my opinion, to ride, especially when the track goes away or when you're starting to get tired. Now, I will tell you that I had the chance to go ride the 2020 Honda 450 when they had their media release for that bike, and I can tell you right now that without a doubt, this bike is better in every single way from the previous Honda. I am going to address the elephant in the room, which is the mapping. I'm sure a lot of you out there have questions about that. If you've been watching some of the other reviews from other magazines, that's really the biggest knock on this new bike is the mapping. And I agree, Honda didn't get it right, but I will give you some of my thoughts here in just a little bit. But like I said, it's better in every way from the previous Honda. The chassis is narrower. And for me, when you talk about the ergonomics of a Honda, that is one thing that I think everyone will agree on. When you get on a Honda, they've done such a great job of just having the rider cockpit in that triangle. It feels very comfortable. When you get on this bike, if you go to a dealership and you get on this, you're gonna have that feeling of, man, I could go fast on this bike. So I really do like the ergos of the Honda. So they've narrowed it down, which for me, being a shorter guy, is a big bonus for me. Again, and as far as the chassis goes, with that 20% less rigidity laterally, that really does help this bike and the characteristic. We're gonna talk more about that as well. And then also with the hydraulic clutch, I'm loving this thing. The previous Hondas have a cable-driven clutch, and I don't like it. It's stiff, it's got a really hard clutch pull, especially when you start to get tired, that thing's just atrocious. With the hydraulic clutch, it's easier to pull, and you don't have to worry about clutch fade. You don't have to ever adjust it. So in my opinion, much better there. You still have your 3 launch controls. You have your 3 engine maps, map 1, which is your standard, map 2 a little bit more mellow, longer pull, then map 3 is more aggressive. You also have your torque control. I love the 3 torque control settings that you have on here. If you're not familiar with that, it's pretty simple. If you get wheel spin, there's a sensor there that senses the RPMs versus the wheel speed, and it just retards the timing a little bit. It just slows it down to help that wheel speed catch back up to the RPMs, and it's noticeable. I love it. And I'll still use a torque control even when I feel like there's plenty of grip. It just gives that little bit of extra help in case a rear tire does want to break loose on you. The track that I rode the second day has some really greasy sections in it. And so I was still able to be aggressive on the throttle, but because I have that torque control, it just makes it less likely that I'm gonna have the rear tire break loose on me. So I love the torque control. I love that the Honda has that. We already talked about ergos, how much I like that. Just looking at the bike, you can see they went to a single muffler exhaust, no more dual exhaust. But let's talk about some of the categories here. So first of all, chassis. That was one of the big knocks on the previous Honda, is the chassis was just too rigid. And when the track would go away, when it would start to get blown out, as a rider, you come into some of those corners and the chassis was just really busy. You would have a hard time getting it to settle down. And especially when the track was square edgy and rough, especially if you were tired, the bike would just beat you up and it would just control the rider more than the rider controlling the bike. And if you were to ask me after I did that 2020 Honda impression, or that ride day, I would not have gone in and bought a Honda. I'm just gonna be honest. It was not one of those bikes that I was excited to get back on and ride. With this bike, because of the improvements with the chassis and other things that we're talking about, this bike to me, I would absolutely walk into a dealership and I would go buy one of these because of the improvements that they have made. So the chassis, the stiffness, it's much better. When I was riding the track that was square edgy with deeper ruts, this chassis to me was much more compliant. It just absorbed the bumps a little bit better. Still not as good as my KX450 that I've been on for the last couple years, or even the Yamaha YZ450F. Their chassis to me are even more compliant. Those bikes, you can just plow through the rough stuff and it gives you confidence. The Honda's better, It's not as good as those bikes, but again, it's a big improvement from the previous model. But what I really enjoyed about this chassis is that as you're coming into, say, a long sweeping rut, you can really lay the bike over and it settles into that rut nicely, and it doesn't want to step up on you, it doesn't want to understeer, oversteer, it just carves through, and the chassis allows the bike to do that. So overall, I really like that aspect. Now, as far as suspension goes on this bike, that to me was one of the drawbacks, and again, this is my opinion, it just felt a little bit soft. I'm 175 pounds, I ride at intermediate level. To me, the forks, they absorb the small chop pretty good, and it has a good feel up top, but the problem is that when you're going faster, you do hit some of those bigger bumps. I feel like you blow through that upper part of the stroke too quickly, and the lower you get in the stroke, the firmer it's gonna start to feel. So it can get more of a harsh feel when you start to get some of those bigger bumps, or if you're too heavy, then you're gonna feel that right away. So for me, I might go with one spring rate higher on one side just to have a little bit more hold up, stay in the softer part of the stroke. But in any case, it's a dirt bike. A lot of you out there are gonna go have this revalved and resprung for your weight and your riding skill anyway, so I wouldn't let that freak you out. But for me, just a little bit soft in the forks. As far as the shock goes, honestly, I didn't really have any complaints with the shock. I went in 1/2 turn stiffer or slower on the high-speed compression. After that, I didn't touch a thing. I felt like it was stable. I didn't get any weird deflecting left or right. It wasn't kicking me weird. You know, going through the rough, choppy sections with the braking bumps, it felt planted. It felt good coming out of corners. So other than that, the fork is where I feel there could be a little bit improvement, just a little bit firmer. But other than that, you got really good show suspension on this bike, and you can make it even better. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the mapping. That's one thing that all the magazines have talked about in their first impressions. And I didn't want to believe the hype. I wanted to believe that they were just kind of being overly picky when they were talking about it. But I will tell you, the first time I hopped on this, I noticed it. Right off the crack of throttle, and it really, to me, I could feel it in all 3 maps. You get a little bit of bog there. It's not a deal breaker to me. I don't want that ECU mapping. I don't want people to think that that's the reason that you shouldn't go buy a Honda if this is one of the bikes that's high on your list. It's right there off the crack of the throttle, but as soon as you get higher up in the RPM and you get into the meat of the power, this bike is phenomenal. It still makes incredible horsepower. And what they've really done with this bike specifically to make it even better, that's a big improvement over the previous generation, is they've made the power more controllable, more manageable. With the previous bike, as soon as you hit the throttle, it was good down low, but then you'd hit kind of a really aggressive spot in the meat of the power, and that Honda was just too much. Even in the mellower maps, it was just an aggressive bike, and it was hard to hold on to, especially as you start to get tired as the track goes away. Just not a friendly bike to ride, and when you have that type of power delivery along with a really rigid chassis, it's just not gonna be the most pleasant ride. With this now, you're still getting all the power that you want, and again, you have the 3 maps, but the power is much more controllable. There is a little bit less of that bog in the map 3, which is the most aggressive map if you wanna do that. You know, being here at higher elevation, that's kind of a bonus for me because I can go in that more aggressive map and I'm not getting as much horsepower as I would down at sea level. So to me, it's a little bit more controllable, but the power delivery on this new Honda is much better. You get more connectivity from the throttle to the rear wheel, you get that to the ground. So you get as much power as you could have. It pulls for a long time, but it's smoother, it's manageable. And when you take that engine characteristic that they've done with this new bike, along with that more forgiving chassis, you have a bike that's gonna be funner to ride, especially for say intermediate or beginner riders. It's not gonna beat you up as much, and it's just funner to ride, especially when the track goes away and it gets rough. This bike's just gonna be more forgiving. So in those categories, Honda has really improved that bike. The only knock I can give is the suspension's a little bit soft, and again, you have that little bog, but I wouldn't let that deter you again from going out and buying one of these if it's high up on your list. As far as cornering goes, that's something that Honda wanted to have. They call it razor sharp cornering. The Honda was already known for being one of the best cornering bikes that is out there, and there is no exception with this new one. With my Kawasaki, that bike corners really well. It's more of a neutral feel. With the Honda, I can turn this thing down a little bit sharper. If I'm coming into a bull turn that doesn't have a rut, I can carve that bull turn a little bit easier. It doesn't want to oversteer where it wants to continue, you know, having that big arc. I can cut this thing down, and like I said earlier, when I lay this into a corner, the bike just lays over so easily. You don't have to fight the bike. With my Kawasaki, sometimes I'd find myself where I come into a corner, I'd lay the bike over, and maybe about halfway through the rut, sometimes it'd want to stand up on me. With the Honda, you're coming into that corner, you pick out your line, and all you got to do is just start to lay the bike over, and it really just does a lot of the work for you. It's got a good balanced feel in my opinion. As long as you get a little bit more hold up in the forks, you're going to be dialed. but corner on this bike, honestly, is probably best in class. It'd be really hard to find a bike, in my opinion, that's gonna corner better than this Honda does. So a couple other things that I think are nice about this bike before we let you go is one, you have 2 mounting positions on the triple clamp. So for shorter guys like me, I like it in the back position, helps me get a little bit farther forward on the bike. If you're a taller guy, you want a little bit more space in the cockpit, you can move those forward. I like having that adjustment there. And also with the air filter, they're going to more of a KTM Husqvarna stylish air filter. Makes it a little bit easier to get that in and out. With the previous models, I really didn't like their design. You had the air filter that had to go behind the battery. You just didn't have a lot of room there. They're set up now much easier. You don't have to remove the seat. You just pop off the side panel here. You can pop the air filter out, put it back in, nice and simple. One last little drawback that I forgot to mention that I think is worth pointing out because I hadn't heard anybody else talk about this yet, but with the hydraulic clutch, Honda did give you the option to run a cable clutch down here if you do want to, but I don't know why they didn't put a plug in there. When you ride this thing in wet conditions or after you wash it, that hole just fills up with water and then it just sits there. So you'd either have to get an air compressor to blow that out or get a towel in there. So I wish they had a plug for that. But aside from that, overall, this bike is rock solid. Like I said, don't let that ECU mapping freak you out. If this is a bike that you've been having your eye on, it's still, in my opinion, an incredible bike. You can make it even better, talking about the things that we talked about today. But in any case, if you guys have questions or comments, if you want more of my feedback, I'm more than happy to give that to you, so make sure to leave those below. And get subscribed to the Rocky Mountain YouTube channel. We're gonna be doing a lot of work on this bike. We're gonna be doing some suspension work. We're gonna be working with Race Tech, kind of getting a good setting for that. We're gonna be seeing what we can do also for that mapping to see if we can help clean that up a little bit, put an exhaust on here. So get subscribed, stay tuned for the other videos that we're gonna be doing with this bike. I'm Chase here at Rocky Mountain, and we'll see you on the trails.